UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon is predicting a surge in the number of Syrian refugees as the violence reaches what he's calling new and appalling heights of brutality. Hello, I'm James Bays, and this is Inside Syria, focusing on the human cost of a conflict now in its 20th month, and it seems no nearer to being resolved. Ban Ki-moon has told the UN General Assembly that civilians are being massacred almost daily, and he says he expects the number of refugees to reach 700,000 by January. The UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, estimates there are more than 465,000 Syrians who fled their homeland. This number takes into account registered refugees and those awaiting registration. Let's break it down further. Over 123,000 Syrians have escaped to Turkey and are known to the authorities there. In Jordan, almost 138,000 Syrians have refugee status or are in the process of obtaining it. More than 133,000 refugees are known to have fled to Lebanon. Another 60,000 refugees have registered in Iraq. And almost 10,000 have registered with the UNHCR in North Africa. But the UN agency stresses tens of thousands of others are also believed to have been forced to leave Syria but haven't registered for help. For more for Inside Syria, here's Kristen Salumi.
Lives in ruins. The families sheltering in this ancient Roman citadel are among the 100,000 Syrians who fled from the bombing in the town of Marat al-Numan.
Our feelings? We are almost dead because of hunger. There is nothing to save us. Is this life? You can't call it life.
The weather is getting colder, but with no means to get to the border, they have no place else to go. And help is not getting to them. The United Nations blames the lack of security and the limited number of aid agencies authorized to work in the country.
We are currently supplying food to about 1.5 million people. We would like to be able to increase that to 2.5 million people, but we don't have the capacity through the partners that we are able to use to increase to that number of people.
Life isn't much better in neighboring countries, like here in Jordan, for the nearly 500,000 people who fled to refugee camps outside Syria.
It is a very bad situation. There is no heat, and the tents are leaking water. Children are dying because of the cold weather. There are no blankets for the children and the women.
Here, the main problem is funding. International donors have contributed less than half of what the UN has requested for humanitarian relief. And with winter setting in, the need is only growing. Kristen Salumi for Inside Syria.
Joining us now for our discussion are our panel of guests. In Vienna, Melissa Fleming, chief spokeswoman for the UN's refugee agency, the UNHCR. In Beirut, Ruba Khoury, she's the country director in Lebanon for Save the Children. And in New York, Sarab Al-Jijakli, he's a member of the National Alliance for Syria, which is a network of Syrian activists and community groups. Can I start with you, please, Melissa? We clearly have a refugee crisis, but is it a crisis that you now have under control or not?
Well, it is gone from bad to worse to verging on horrific. I mean, what civilians are going through in this conflict is absolutely dramatic. Not only are they fleeing across borders by the thousands every day, but they're also internally forced to flee and are seeking shelter in places that are not appropriate shelters. So it's a very, very dramatic situation, and it has gotten worse. Of course, our response has increased, but we still have so much need and very funding shortage, as was mentioned in the introduction.
Ruba, can I ask you, from your perspective on the ground in Lebanon, how bad are things?
I can't but support Melissa. It's bad. The situation is growing worse day by day, especially with the arrival of winter. It's getting cold. The Bekaa area and the north area where the refugees are taking hostage, they're staying in Lebanon, it's very cold area, and we will have snow very soon. The shelters where they're staying, it's not adequate. The funding is very short, and we have 51% of the refugees being children below 18, which will need special attention during winter season.
Sarab, in New York, I know you've recently been to Turkey and that northern border with Syria. Tell us about the situation you found there. How bad are things from that perspective?
Quite frankly, it is terrible. I just returned from liberated Syria, the Idlib province, in the refugee camp of Atma, which is right across the Turkish border. And what we have there is a small view into what the people inside the country are dealing with. They are living under the constant bombardment and artillery shells of the regime, yet they have no homes, living in tent cities with minimal support from the outside world, living in terrible conditions.
Minimal support from the outside world. What would you say about the role of UNHCR? Because we've got Melissa here on the panel representing them. They are the body representing the international community dealing with this. Are they doing enough, Sarab?
Well, I can't speak to the job that they're doing externally for the refugees that are in neighboring countries. However, inside the country, there is no presence whatsoever, not just by the United Nations, however, by most NGOs. Currently, in Atma refugee camp, which is, again, across the border, the camp there is administered by activists and protected by the Free Syrian Army. Food, aid, medical supplies, anything that is needed for sustenance is brought in by individual donations and minimal NGO support from across the border in Turkey. However, there's no systematic approach to helping these people. Only a few months ago, 11,000 people were living under the olive grove trees under the skies of Idlib. And when a few activists saw what sort of condition they were living in, they individually purchased tents, so at least they would not be sleeping underneath the sky and had a little bit of cover. Right now we're in a situation where this camp, specifically in Atma, has about 13,000 people. Only this week was bombed twice by Assad's MiGs, and still, to this point, very little outside support. These people are living in, as I said, terrible conditions with almost no hope.
Melissa, you heard that there. No systematic approach to this. You are the system. Are you doing enough?
Obviously, the situation, as he described, is desperate. Our biggest worry is access. Our biggest concern is that there are people, like the 13,000 estimated in Idlib that he mentioned, that the UN system can't access for security reasons. There is the possibility for those people to cross the border into Turkey. And once they do cross, obviously there's a great deal of assistance possible inside Syria. There are, unfortunately, many parts of the country that we can't reach. There are, though, to correct the record, many cities, towns, villages that are being being served by the UN to the best possible. UNHCR, the World Food Program, the WHO, the World Health Organization, delivering critical medical supplies, UNICEF helping with supplies for children. It's not enough, absolutely. It's not only a funding question. The funding question is critical, but it's a question of access. Where there is fighting, where there is violence, it's very, very difficult. I'd like to note we do work through the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which has been working impartially to reach people, and they do go to places that are very dangerous. Many of their own people have lost their lives. Our own trucks have come under fire, have been hijacked. So it's a very precarious situation in which we're working. It doesn't make us feel good. We want to help all the people, but it is unfortunately at this point not possible.
Melissa, has your planning been good enough in all this? We go back to the beginning of the year, and you were talking about 185,000 refugees. We heard Ban Ki-moon speak in the last few hours, now saying 700,000 refugees. This is a situation that's gone on for 20 months. You seem to be behind the curve on it.
Well, the 700,000 is actually a UNHCR figure, and that Mr. Ban Ki-moon was quoting. So that is our planning figure. Right now, we are at almost the 500,000 refugee mark. But there are many more people, Syrians, in the neighboring countries who have not yet registered. They crossed early in the crisis, early in the conflict, had their own means, had relatives, had friends. As this stay wears out, as their financial possibilities dwindle, we do expect many more of those people who are already in those countries to come forward and request assistance. That's why we have the figure. We said 700,000 till the end of the year. We're at about 465,000 now. We could have many more in the coming weeks. And as the colleague from from Save the Children said we are in a very urgent mode of what we call winterization, trying to reach the people who are in the camps. But most refugees are actually in urban areas, and we're trying to reach them and the families who are hosting them with financial and material aid so that they can survive the winter.
Sarab in New York, if I can ask you, Melissa says there almost 500,000 registered refugees, but many more that aren't registered. Have you any idea what your estimate is of the total number of people who have been displaced, who are refugees outside their country? What's your estimate?
There are estimates upwards. There's upwards to 2 million people internally displaced. So while the figures that are provided by my colleagues on this panel are 500,000 or 700,000, that's externally displaced refugees, which is a tragedy. However, if you look inside the country, we're dealing with something that much bigger, threefold, 2 million plus individuals who are on the move. And this is, again, because of the deliberate campaign to create a massive humanity on the move by the Assad regime, so that the revolutionaries can't focus on revolution, rather they have to focus on relief work. And that's what we're seeing in this microcosm on the Turkish border, on the Syrian side of the border in Atma refugee camp, where the camp is administered by activists, many of whom used to coordinate only a few months ago the protests, who used to coordinate the strikes and so on. So what we're seeing is that inside the country, while it's terrible outside, inside the country, it is that much worse. Because not only are these people living in terrible conditions, as what we described earlier, there's no access to these individuals to maintain any sort of relief effort, and they are under constant threat of violence, not just from the Assad regime on the ground, but also from the skies, as we've witnessed in Atma this past week from the MiGs that have hit the camp and the village nearby.
Ruba, we don't know the real figures, but if you listen to what we've just heard, it could be as many as 10%, 20% of Syrians who are now being displaced. It's quite appalling, the numbers here.
It's appalling. As we mentioned, in Lebanon, the number of registered or in the process of being registered with UNHCR in Lebanon is around 133,000. But we are conducting, as Save the Children, a back-to-school campaign now, funded mainly by UNHCR, who is coordinating and really doing an immense effort in Lebanon, not only to provide funding, but also to advocate with donors and duty bearers towards the refugees. And with the back-to-school campaign, where we have registered more than 8,000 children, we have noticed that we have a figure of around 30% of the children approaching us who are not registered with UNHCR. So this shows almost a figure from another NGO working on health. I heard that also they have almost 50% of the people approaching them as Syrian refugees. They're not registered also with UNHCR. So it shows that the 133,000 might reflect, let's say, 70% to 80% of the figures, but we will still have a large number of unregistered Syrian. And if you might allow me, I would also like to mention the Palestinian Syrians who have left also Damascus camps and now have arrived to Lebanon. We don't have the figures. The last guess was around 11,000, and we have a lot of Syrian Lebanese returnees from Syria, and we have also the host community directly affected, because like in Lebanon, we don't have camps. So most of the refugees, they're staying in host communities, they're staying in unfinished buildings, they're even cleaning farms and barns to stay with their families. And it's really like, you cannot imagine parents, the situation they're going through. They feel they cannot provide for their children. UN and international NGOs, they're trying to provide, but the needs are huge, and sometimes we have a lot of also security issues in different areas, which doesn't make it as easy all the time to reach to the refugees.
Melissa from UNHCR, we hear about the situation in Lebanon, where there are no refugee camps. In Jordan, it's completely different. There are large refugee camps there. What are the challenges in Jordan?
Well, as of now, there's just one, but there's another one about to be built. So those going into the camp, it's about 30,000 refugees in that camp, and it was built on a strip of desert. So the challenges are to create a decent city for 30,000 people that people feel satisfied living in to a certain degree. Of course, living in a tent is miserable anywhere.
Would you say that there is a decent city now, Melissa? Would you say there's a decent city now? We've had reports of children dying of cold. We've had reports of abuse, underage girls being forced into marriage.
Well, absolutely, there are problems. There were problems in any sudden society, in any refugee camp in the world. People, a group of people traumatized, fleeing war, coming to a new place, having given up their livelihoods, their family, having lost family members. This is not going to be a very nice situation for them to live in. What we are trying to do is to make sure they have shelter, they are warm, they have food, the kids can go to school, that they have psychological help, and that there is family unification. Again, there is more to be done. As the numbers continue to rise, we are, racing against time to help them. We have a big challenge also in Jordan too, because the majority of the refugees are actually living in cities. And so if they're in a camp, it is easier to access the people, to find out what their needs are, and to provide the shelter. But when they're in cities, when their money is running out, when their rent is up and they can't pay for it anymore, they have to be registered with UNHCR. We have to be able to identify them to know how we can help them. So this is a bigger challenge for us in Jordan.
But can I return to the ones that are in the camp for now? We had an interview at Al Jazeera with the special representative, Lakhdar Brahimi, back in September, when he proposed moving those people from tents, putting them in prefabricated huts. He said that wouldn't cost much, it would just cost $60 million. You knew winter was coming. Why hasn't that happened?
In fact, it is happening, and thanks to a generous donation from the government of Saudi Arabia, there are what we call prefab houses being built. Actually, they're being constructed very cleverly, or they're built very clever, that they can be dismantled and then rebuilt should these people be able to return home to Syria. Many of their homes, as you know, have been destroyed. So looking to the future, being able to use some of the investment in shelter that we're making right now is something that we are supporting. Of course, it is a bit more expensive than the tents, and so we are seeking funding to be able to establish this more. As the crisis goes on and this becomes a more long-term situation for these people, of course, it's much better. In Turkey, the Turkish government has invested in, not in all the camps, but many people are living in sheltered homes that were built by the Turkish government. Of course, that's much better for them.
OK, bring in Sarab on that one. You raised an eyebrow when the Turkish government's response was just mentioned. What do you think about what the Turkish government has been doing? Because there are persistent reports it's stopping refugees at times crossing. It's not letting them come to Turkey.
Well, I think in general, we're very happy that the Turkish authorities have allowed over 100,000 refugees to come into Turkey, and they have provided basic needs for many of those individuals. In Atma camp in Idlib province, the refugees are there because they were not granted access to cross the border, and that's why they're stuck on the border areas on the Syrian side of the line. But basically what we're really hoping for is that UN agencies, international agencies, focus more attention to the inside, in the liberated areas. Now, yes, it is dangerous, but you do have partners on the ground that you can access to deliver aid. And that's what we're seeing. This is how in Atma camp, which is a microcosm of the entire area, how these people are not starving to death. There is a trickle of food coming in from sources, from activists, from NGOs on the border. What we do need is a more concerted effort from the United Nations and other agencies to help these people and help these partners do what they need to do to make sure that these people in this coming winter, the 13,000 people of Atma and beyond, don't starve and don't freeze to death.
Ruba, can I take your view on that? Do you think more can be done inside?
I think many NGOs and UN agencies and donors have been waiting to ensure access inside Syria. And this what also has hindered the full funding of the appeal done by UN. So it's now still, we have a shortage of 200 million, even in the neighboring countries, including Syria. So I think in general it's a funding issue, but also it's security issues. I know that many NGOs are operating, and some are operating, as mentioned now, through partners, but it's not enough. I think, yes, the needs are huge, but the same in the neighboring countries. The needs are huge everywhere, and really we need to be able to respond now, to have our plans, to have funding available now, because if winter is there, what we're hearing stories about children all over inside Syria and in the neighboring countries suffering from health issues because of the cold. We have children arriving who have been out of school for 18 months, it seems, inside Syria, and they arrive to neighboring countries. We need to provide them also with support. I think the needs are huge everywhere, and the international community need to be really available now to respond to the needs of the Syrian children.
Melissa, we'll come to the funding issue in a moment, but can I ask you about the situation inside Syria? I know that UNHCR got a team into Homs very recently. What did you find there?
Yes. Well, I'd just like to also respond. We do have assurances from all the neighboring countries that the borders remain open. That particular border in Turkey, they are allowing people in a staggered manner. That is a certain number per day, but these are high numbers too, up to 500, sometimes 1,000 people per day.
Understood.
As quickly as they can
Glad you
build
make that
camps.
point. Can we move
so
on to Homs?
let's go back to Homs. Homs is, our team arrived there, just came out yesterday, spent a couple of days. We have been delivering aid pretty remotely as it's been extremely violent in that city. They were able to go in and assess the situation and came back quite stunned at how bad it is. They found people, hundreds of people living in abandoned buildings that are now communal shelters with UNHCR plastic sheets serving as doors and windows and
how
separators.
Many people in
no
total?
Heat whatsoever.
Melissa, how many people in total? Because I saw some amazing report that your people thought there were 250,000 people who were in squalid condition in Homs.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That is correct. At least that many, what we could assess from that number. The internally displaced situation. These are people who lived perhaps in other parts of the city and fled to these shelters within the city, or they're coming from other parts of Syria. So, many of the internally displaced in Syria have been internally displaced not just once, but many times over. And to live in these shelters, the basic services in general in Homs are running dry, not just for the internally displaced, but for everyone. Half of the hospitals are closed. 60% of the doctors have fled.
Okay, can I stop you there, Melissa, because we are running short of time, and I do want to come on to the funding issue. There are two international funds trying to raise money to pay for all of this. One is the Syrian Humanitarian Assistance Fund. That's the one dealing for the situation inside Syria. It needs $348 million, yet countries have so far only funded 50% of it. And then there's the other one, the Regional Response Plan, which needs $487 million. It's just 38% funded. This is disgraceful. What's your message to the international community? Melissa.
Our message to the international community is that these funds are serving the innocent people inside Syria and in the surrounding countries, and they are bolstering the surrounding countries who've been so generous in keeping their borders open, allowing refugees to be hosted on their territory and using their own supplies and hosting them. So these people of Syria need to be supported, as do the countries who are helping them.
So which countries, Melissa, which countries have not given you the money then? Time to name and shame them, isn't it?
We're not in the business of naming and shaming.
Shouldn't you be now? Shouldn't you be now? Isn't the time for polite diplomacy over? This is this appalling situation. Shouldn't you be naming those countries who haven't given enough money right now?
Yes. Well, that's one way of going about it. We are constantly working with these countries. We're advocating for funds. We do believe that the money is going to come, but we have to every day make it known that it's not there yet. Not all the needs are being supplied.
Thank you very much, Melissa. A big thank you to all our guests, Melissa Fleming in Vienna, Ruba Khoury in Beirut, and Sarab Al-Jijakli joining us from New York. And thank you for joining us. A reminder, you can find extensive coverage and reports on the conflict in Syria on our website. That's aljazeera.com, where you can also view this programme again and other Al Jazeera programmes. For now, goodbye.